I was once a sperm donor at a very difficult phase of my life, but once I was able to gain a stable ground, I quit. Years later, that donation came around as a consequence of my negligence and ruined my life. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I was eating lunch at my desk, the same desk I'd had for 11 years, in the same office attached to the same yard where I kept the equipment for my contracting business, in the same small town in the Derbyshire outskirts where I'd lived since I was 28. The envelope had the court's official stamp and my full legal name on the front, spelled correctly and with my middle initial, which meant whoever sent it had access to documentation rather than just a general address. I opened it without urgency. I was 46 years old and I had built a life that didn't produce surprises. I was a bachelor by intention rather than circumstance, solvent, established, respected in the specific quiet way of someone who does reliable work in a small community and doesn't cause problems. My life had a shape I had chosen and maintained. I was not the kind of person who received unexpected court correspondence. I read the first page and my lunch went cold. I'm going to have to go back before I can go forward. That's the structure this needs, not because I want to protect myself from the harder parts, but because without the context, what happened makes no sense. And I want it to make sense. I've spent 14 months living inside something that felt senseless, and putting it in order is the only way I know how to talk about it. When I was 23, I was at a specific kind of bottom that I don't think has a clean name. Not the bottom of addiction or crisis in the medical sense, just the bottom of finances and options, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding things together alone for long enough that the holding has become the whole of their life. I'd moved out of my parents' house in South Yorkshire at 18 for a construction management program at a college in Sheffield. My family, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I say my family, because they matter later in this account, my family were religious, conservative in the specific way of communities that have maintained their values across generations through collective enforcement rather than individual conviction. They were not cruel people. They were people for whom the shape of a life had been established long before any individual life arrived, and departure from that shape was understood as betrayal rather than choice. I had departed, college first, then the part-time jobs that kept me in college, then the decision after college not to return to South Yorkshire but to stay in the Midlands and build something of my own. My parents communicated their feelings about this through the particular method of my family, which was sustained reference to what other people's children were doing and periodic invitations to events I was expected to attend and demonstrate correct living at. I managed the relationship carefully. I went to Christmas. I attended weddings and funerals. I answered calls. I did not return permanently. At 23, I had 2 part-time jobs, a room in a shared house, and a situation with a contractor I'd been working for that collapsed without warning when the contractor folded. I won't go into the specifics of the financial unraveling because the specifics aren't the point. The point is that I arrived at a period of approximately 4 months during which I could not see a clear way forward, and I made decisions I wouldn't have made otherwise. Donating sperm was one of them. I want to be clear about what I understood myself to be doing. I understood it as a medical procedure with commercial compensation, governed by a legal framework that I engaged with through paperwork I signed in full, in a clinic registered with the HFEA, in a process designed to separate the donor permanently from any downstream consequences. I signed a parental rights waiver. I signed multiple consent and liability documents. I was told, clearly and in writing, that any resulting children would have no legal claim on me as a parent, and that my anonymity was protected under the donor agreements of the time. I did this for 4 months. Then my situation stabilized, I found steadier work, and I stopped. I put it in a category in my mind labeled finished, and I closed the category and I did not revisit it. That was 23 years before the envelope. The court order required me to respond within a specific window. I called a solicitor in Derby the next morning, a man named Philip Greer, who had handled a contractual dispute for me several years earlier, and who I trusted for the quality I most value in professionals, which is the specific willingness to tell you something unpleasant without softening it beyond recognition. I told him what the order said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The claim is that you're the biological father of a 15-year-old. Is that possible?" I told him about the donation. He said, "And you have documentation of the waiver?" I said, "I assumed it was on file with the clinic." He said, "We'll need to see that before anything else." The clinic, Meridian Fertility Solutions, a registered HFEA provider that had been operating in Nottingham since the early 2000s, was subpoenaed for my records within the week. Philip's firm was efficient in the way of people who have done this before. The response came back in 12 days. My parental rights waiver was not in the file. Philip called me with this information in the particular tone of someone delivering a fact they wish were different. He said, "It may have been misfiled. It may have been lost. It may never have been properly processed." He said, "Regardless of the reason, its absence is the problem." He said, "Until we can resolve the documentation question, the court is likely to proceed on the assumption that standard legal parentage applies." I said, "Which means what?" He said, "Which means there's going to be a period during which you may be required to take temporary responsibility for the child." I said, "I've never met this child." He said, "I know." I said, "I donated sperm at 23. I signed every document they put in front of me." He said, "I know, we're going to make that case. It's a good case, but the missing waiver means we can't make it instantly." There was a silence on the phone that I used to understand what he was telling me. He said, "It probably won't be long." It was 8 months. The boy arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early March. His name was Connor. He was 15, with the specific closed-off quality that 15-year-olds carry when they've been through something, and have decided that demonstrating they've been through it isn't something they're willing to do. He had 2 bags, a large duffel and a smaller backpack, and he stood in the hallway of my house and looked around at a space that was entirely strange to him, with the practiced blankness of someone trying not to want anything from the environment. I want to tell you what I said to him, because I've thought about whether I regret it, and I've arrived somewhere complicated on the question. I told him clearly and without performance that I had not planned for him, had not asked for him, and was contesting the legal situation through my solicitor. I told him that while he was in my house, I would ensure his basic needs were met: food, a room, transport to his school, and that I expected basic courtesy in return. I told him this was not a hostile environment, but it was not a welcoming one, and that I thought it was better for him to understand that plainly than to operate under a misapprehension. He listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once, the nod of someone who has already factored in this outcome, and said he understood. Then he asked where his room was. I've thought about that nod, about the specific quality of it, not defeated, not resigned, something more like recognition. He had expected this. He had arrived already knowing that nobody on the other end of this situation was choosing him. That's not something a child should know how to carry at 15, and he was carrying it with a competence that came from practice. I registered that. I was too depleted and too angry to do anything with it, but I registered it. Over the following weeks, he made several attempts, which I can describe now with more clarity than I could process them at the time. Small things. He asked once whether I wanted him to help with anything. He made tea one morning and left a cup on the kitchen counter without comment. He was quiet in the way of someone who has learned that a reduced footprint is the safest approach to an unwelcoming space. He kept his room tidy to the point where I would sometimes check if he was still there. Each time he tried something, I was civil and I was clear. I told him I appreciated the gesture and that it wasn't necessary. I told him we were in a temporary situation, and I didn't want him to misread my needs as an invitation to connection, because I wasn't looking for one. I said this without cruelty. I was careful about the without cruelty part, and he received it each time with the same small nod. I knew, clinically, what I was doing. I was maintaining a boundary that was entirely understandable given the situation I had been placed in without consent. I was also doing it to a 15-year-old who had lost his parents, been sold by his neighbors, and delivered to a stranger who had just told him, with great clarity, not to hope. I knew that. I want to be honest that I knew that, and I did it anyway. My family found out 4 weeks after Connor arrived. I had been managing the information carefully. My situation was not something I intended to share widely, for obvious reasons. But my mother had a network that had always functioned with the particular efficiency of communities where information is currency, and someone somewhere in the chain of people who knew had told someone who told her. She called on a Saturday morning. I was in my office dealing with invoices. I answered because I always answer, even when I know what's coming. The conversation went in 2 phases. The first phase was about the donation. She said the word with the particular inflection people use when they want to communicate that the word itself is a problem: donation. She said it like she was picking it up with something other than her hands. She said, "This is what you were doing when you left home. This is the kind of person you became." There was reference to the values of our family. There was reference to God. There was reference to my grandfather, who had been a man of specific religious conviction, and what he would have thought of his grandson selling. And she used the word selling, which I noted and did not correct selling like that. I let most of it pass. I had been letting most of what my family said about my life choices pass for 20-odd years, and I had the specific technique of it. The second phase was about Connor. This phase was warm. This phase had a quality of excitement underneath it that I found, in some ways, harder to sit with than the judgment. She said, "But the boy, though, the boy is here now." She said it in the tone of someone identifying a silver lining that resolves the cloud entirely. She said there was a reason for things. She used the phrase God's plan with the complete conviction of someone for whom this phrase has never failed to provide an answer. She said, "You always told us you didn't need a family. And now God has sent you one." I said, "God didn't send me anything. A legal failure sent me a court order." She said, "Don't be like that." I said, "I'm contesting the situation through my solicitor, and the boy will go into appropriate care when the case resolves." There was a silence that had something in it I recognized as preparation. Then she said, "You can't send that child away. He's yours." I said, "He's biologically related to me. That's not the same thing." She said, "In this family it is." My aunt called that afternoon. My father called that evening. He said less than my mother, and he said it more quietly, but the substance was the same. Cousins sent messages over the following days with varying degrees of directness. The family had arrived at a consensus, which families like mine do with remarkable speed when the consensus is available, and the consensus was, this was an opportunity for me to become what they had always wanted me to be, and I was to take it. I said the same things to all of them. I said I understood their perspective, and I was not going to be adopting Connor. I said it each time with the patience of someone who knows they're not going to be heard and has decided to speak anyway for reasons of their own. While all of this was happening, Philip was doing the work that actually mattered. The subpoena on Meridian Fertility Solutions had produced my incomplete file, but the firm's investigation had gone further than that. Philip had brought in a specialist, a woman named Rashida, who dealt specifically with fertility law and whose particular talent, as Philip described it, was finding the thing inside an organization's documentation that the organization would prefer not to be found. What she found took 6 weeks. Meridian had been operating a secondary revenue stream alongside its legitimate clinical services. Patient data, donor records, recipient information, The detailed biological and legal documentation of thousands of people who had engaged with the clinic under the assumption of confidentiality had been sold, not in isolated incidents, systematically over a period of years, to entities that Philip described in our meeting with the careful language of someone who knows the words are going to land hard. He said, the data was sold to what are broadly described as information brokers. Some of those brokers had connections to schemes designed to establish legal claims against individuals through manufactured parental situations. I said, someone bought my information specifically to find a biological parent for Connor. He said, that appears to be what happened. I said, who bought it? He said, that's the second part. Connor's parents had died in a road accident 18 months earlier. They had left an estate that included a hedge fund, significant, carefully built, the kind of financial instrument that takes years of deliberate planning to accumulate. Connor had been their only child. In the absence of other named beneficiaries, the fund was held in trust for him. The neighbors, a couple who had lived 3 doors down from Connor's family for 12 years, who had been named as powers of attorney during his parents' lives for the practical purposes that neighbors sometimes serve, had been managing his affairs since the accident. They shared no last name with Connor and no blood relation. The fund was in his name alone. They could not access it directly. What they could do, and what they had apparently decided to do, was create a situation in which the fund's management passed to a legal guardian. Specifically, a guardian with parental rights who could then be leveraged, legally, in ways that a neighbor without parental status could not be. They had used a portion of the fund to purchase donor data from Meridian's brokers. My data. They had identified me as a viable target, a bachelor with no immediate family in the legal sense, whose missing waiver created an exploitable gap in the donor protections I had signed up for. They had filed the court order. Connor had been sent to me not because anyone thought I was his parent in any meaningful sense. He had been sent to me because I was a door to his money. I sat in Philip's office for a long time after he finished explaining this. He said, I want to be clear that Connor had no knowledge of any of this. I said, I know. He said, he was as much a victim of the arrangement as you were. I said, I know. What I felt in that moment was not sympathy. What I felt was the specific anger of someone who has had a situation explained to them in full and understands now exactly why they're in it and cannot do anything with that understanding except carry it. Connor was innocent. The neighbors had sold him. I had been chosen as the vehicle. The clinic had provided the mechanism. Everyone in the chain was guilty of something except the 15-year-old in my spare room, who was guilty only of having been born and of having lost his parents. I knew all of that. I still went home that evening and felt my chest tighten when I heard him moving around upstairs. The case took 8 months from the court order to resolution. I'm not going to reconstruct every step of it because 8 months of litigation is not a thing that benefits from detail. It benefits from compression, which is what I'll give you. What mattered was this. Philip and Rashida built a case on 3 foundations. The missing waiver, which they argued had been improperly handled by Meridian and could not be used as evidence of failed consent. The clinic's illegal data selling operation, which established that the court order had been initiated through fraudulent means. And the neighbor's scheme, which Philip pursued with the specific relentlessness of someone who finds a particular kind of case motivating and has found it. The neighbors, when the full investigation was presented to them, produced the specific behavior of people whose scheme has been exposed in a context they hadn't prepared for. They had prepared for no one looking closely. They had not prepared for a forensic specialist and a fertility law expert and a solicitor who charged by the hour and was very good at what he did. The court ruled in my favor on the parental rights question. The missing waiver, combined with the fraudulent origins of the court order, was sufficient to terminate the forced guardianship. My biological relationship to Connor was noted in the judgment, and then set aside as legally irrelevant to the question of parental responsibility in the absence of consent documentation and in the presence of demonstrated fraud. The neighbors faced criminal charges. The fund was recovered, most of it, not all of it. A meaningful portion had already been spent in ways that were recoverable on paper and not in practice. Connor was placed in foster care. A family in Nottinghamshire, Philip told me, assessed, appropriate, with experience of children who had been through significant disruption. I was told the date of the handoff. I was present when it happened because the legal situation required my presence for the final transfer of temporary guardianship. Connor came downstairs with his 2 bags and his smaller backpack. He stood in the hallway in the same spot where he had stood on the Wednesday in March when he arrived, and he looked like someone who had been in transit for a long time and had stopped expecting the transit to end somewhere comfortable. I said, "The family you're going to comes with good references." He nodded. I said, "The fund will be managed properly now. You'll have access to it when you're 18. He nodded again. He looked at me for a moment, not with accusation, not with the particular reproach of a child who has been failed, just the direct, assessing look of someone taking a final measurement of something they're leaving behind. Then he picked up his bags. The car came. He got in. I stood at the door and watched it drive away, and I felt the specific quality of a person watching something resolve that was never going to resolve well. The public disclosure came 3 weeks later. I still don't know who did it. I've been through the list of possibilities so many times that the list has stopped producing new arrangements. The clinic, a disgruntled employee, someone from my family who thought exposure would force my hand, the neighbors buying one more piece of damage on their way out. Philip investigated. We found no conclusive source. What we found was the outcome. A local news site ran a story. Then a regional site picked it up. Then the social media version of it, which is always more durable and more damaging than the original. The story, as it was told in these venues, was local contractor discovered to be anonymous sperm donor, linked to court case involving orphan child. The court case framing made it sound like I had been fighting to avoid a child who needed a parent. The donor revelation was presented with the specific editorial energy of people who find transgression more interesting than context. My business took the first hit. 2 clients called within the same week to tell me they were going in a different direction. A third stopped returning calls. The yard felt different in the weeks after, the specific quality of a small community that has processed a piece of information and is now in the stage of deciding what to do with it, which in practice meant people were polite to my face, and I knew what that meant. My family called. These calls were different from the earlier ones, less the performance of concern and more the performance of having been proven right. Several people said some version of, "We told you this lifestyle would catch up with you." Several other people said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. My mother cried on the phone, which might have been genuine grief, and might have been the particular grief of a woman who had wanted me to live differently, and was now watching the consequences of me not doing so, and I was too tired to locate the difference. Philip filed a defamation suit 6 weeks after the public disclosure. We identified the news site and the specific claims that were factually inaccurate, the framing of the court case, the characterization of my motivations, several details that had been presented as fact without verification. The suit produced a settlement, a partial retraction, and the sealing of my records in ways that limited future searchability. It also produced a legal bill. By the time I had paid Philip's firm, covered my own costs during the 8 months of temporary guardianship, absorbed the business losses from the reputational damage, and received the compensation from both the clinic and the neighbors, I was approximately £38,000 behind where I had started. The compensation covered roughly half of that gap. I relocated 8 months after the case resolved. Not dramatically, I'd been in the Derbyshire area for 18 years, and I had professional relationships and a life there that I didn't leave lightly. But the town's knowledge of me had been restructured by what had happened, and restructured knowledge of that kind doesn't fully reverse. It accretes. It becomes part of how people understand you. I could see the shape of it in enough small interactions to know that I wasn't going to outlast it on familiar ground. I found work in a smaller community in Cumbria. I brought the relationships I could bring and rebuilt the ones I couldn't. I'm 47 now and the business is functional, which is a different word from thriving, and I'm working toward a version of the latter. I want to be honest about where I am with Connor, because I think honesty is the only thing this account has that justifies putting it somewhere public. I know he was innocent. I knew it the whole time. I knew it the day he stood in my hallway with his 2 bags, and I told him not to misread my needs as an invitation. I knew it the morning he left the tea on the counter. I knew it the day I watched the car drive away, and felt only the resolution of something unpleasant rather than the particular grief of a 15-year-old going from one temporary situation to another. Knowing it didn't change what I felt, that's the part I'm still sitting with. The exhaustion of that period, the financial drain, the legal process, the family calls, the business damage, the public exposure, accumulated into something that needed somewhere to go, and the most available somewhere was the person whose arrival had started it. That's not fair. It's also what happened. I've thought about whether he's all right. Philip told me the foster placement went well in the initial assessment. I don't have further information and I've decided not to seek it, because seeking it would be a decision that requires me to want something, and I don't think I'm the right person to want things where Connor is concerned. What he needed was not me. He got something else. I hope the something else was enough. That's as far as I can get with it. Here is what I want you to take from this account, because I said at the start that I was putting it somewhere public for a reason. I signed the documents, all of them. I believed the legal framework I engaged with was the one I would continue to be governed by. I was wrong, not because the framework failed in any abstract sense, but because a specific clinic failed to process a specific piece of paper, and that failure sat dormant for 23 years until someone found it and used it. The paperwork matters. I want to be specific about what I mean, because check your paperwork is advice that's easy to give and hard to action in the moment of giving it. What I mean is, obtain independent confirmation. Not the clinic's assurance, not the agency's word, your own copy, filed somewhere you control, of every document that constitutes a legal waiver or consent. If you are engaging with any system that involves biological information, parental rights, or long-term legal status, the document you signed is only as useful as your ability to produce it independently. I didn't do that. I trusted the system to hold what I had given it. The system lost my document, and the loss cost me 14 months of my life and a significant sum of money and a level of public exposure I have spent additional money managing. That's the specific thing. That's what I wish I had known. The other thing, and I'll say this once and leave it, is about desperation. I made the donation at 23 because I was desperate, and because it was available, and because I told myself the legal framework was sufficient protection, and I was right about the protection, and I was right about the framework, and none of that was enough. Desperation is not a moral failure. I want to be clear about that because I spent more time than I should have, in the years after, applying my family's framework to my own decisions and arriving at their conclusions. Desperation is what happens when the options are limited and the pressure is real, and you do the most rational thing available to you at the time. What you owe yourself in that moment is not abstention from the available option. What you owe yourself is the documentation that protects the decision you've made. I'm in Cumbria. The business is functional. I am 47 years old and considerably less naive about the specific ways that paper trails can be used for or against you, and I have not spoken to my family in the way I used to speak to them, and I am still, Underneath the anger and the tiredness, the same person who built something out of nothing in Derbyshire and is building something again in Cumbria. That has to be enough. Some days it is.